In the city of Ebelstein, there lived a man known to the locals as the Lying Old Geezer. To the people dwelling within the city's slums, he was nothing more than a shabby, aging figure who appeared far past his prime. Despite his humble appearance, he possessed a boastful streak that bordered on the outrageous. He frequently paraded through the streets calling himself a great mage, even though he was only capable of performing basic, one-star magic. His temper was just as notorious as his claims. He was known to completely lose his composure and lash out at the local children whenever they tried to pull a prank on him. Yet, beneath that abrasive exterior lay a different reality for one individual. Looking back at that irritable, boastful man, the narrator reveals a surprising truth. That old man was the very person who taught them magic. There was no grand, noble reason for their arrangement. Sitting by a flickering campfire, the dynamic was born of mutual, simple needs. The old man, desperate for validation, simply required followers to entertain his delusions of grandeur. In return, the boy sat quietly, for he simply needed knowledge. Winter's frost-covered branches eventually gave way to the vibrant greens and fluttering butterflies of spring. The seasons bled into one another as their training continued. Through the passage of time, the boy remained dedicated, often found pushing his limits in secluded clearings. Under the watchful eye of the old man, he would focus until a brilliant blue mana radiated from his body, his hands pressed firmly against the earth as he channeled the power he had so sought to understand. The old man watched in stunned silence, his eyes fixed on the boy. He got a grasp over the flow of mana, he thought, the possibility hanging heavy in the air. Could this child truly possess such innate talent? Before him, the white-haired boy focused every ounce of his will. A surge of brilliant blue energy erupted from his hands, coalescing into a shimmering, ethereal arrow. With a sharp cry of effort, he unleashed the projectile. The mana bolt streaked through the air with a piercing whistle, striking a distant tree with a violent burst of light. The old man stared at the scorched bark, his expression unreadable as he realized the magnitude of what he had just witnessed. That moment marked the beginning of a long journey. The boy spent an entire year by the old man's side, laboring through every kind of mundane errand and grueling chore assigned to him. Yet, through the sweat and the service, he honed his craft. By the end of that year, he was no longer just a talented child, he had officially become a one-star mage. Under the cover of night, the old man sat by the campfire, his face flushed from the bottle in his hand. Between heavy hiccups, he began another one of his long rants about the world beyond the northern wall of Ebelstein. He claimed that in those lands, noble brats could reach the 3-star level even before their coming-of-age ceremonies. That's a realm a lowborn like you could spend your whole life polishing yourself for and still barely reach, he muttered, leaning in close as the boy quietly ate his bread. His voice was sharp with a warning, so don't get cocky. With skills like yours, you'll collapse the moment you hit the wall of 2 stars. To the old man, magic was entirely a matter of bloodlines, and he insisted that no matter how hard a commoner struggled, it was ultimately futile. The boy listened in silence, realizing that his mentor was obsessed with drilling the notion of an insurmountable wall between nobles and commoners into his head. He couldn't help but wonder if these bitter lectures were merely a manifestation of the old man's longing for everything he had failed to achieve himself. That night felt unusually long as the old man eventually drifted into a deep, alcohol-induced sleep. As the boy looked down at him, rain lashed against the muddy earth when he returned the next day, but the cold water was nothing compared to the sight that met him. The old man was dead. His body lay crumpled in the dirt, a map of dark bruises and swelling that told a story of a brutal, one-sided struggle. Initially, he assumed the old man had simply been himself, stubborn and reckless enough to pick a fight he couldn't win. He imagined some tavern brawl or a disagreement with a hot-headed local. He gripped the shovel, the rhythmic thud of metal hitting wet soil the only sound in the gloom as he prepared a final resting place. The truth, however, surfaced later, and it was far more bitter. The old man hadn't died in a random scuffle, he had been beaten to death by the guards. They claimed they had caught him red-handed, attempting to steal a 2-star spellbook from a guarded warehouse. He stood by the crude wooden cross in the pouring rain, staring down at the fresh mound of earth. It didn't make sense. No one who knew the man could understand why someone so devoid of ambition, someone who seemed content to simply exist on the fringes, would risk everything for a piece of magic he didn't even need. The old man, that lying old geezer, had always spent his time preaching about the importance of bloodlines. But for the boy, noble blood was an impossibility. He looked at the glowing blue notification floating in his vision, a prompt to unlock the basics of magic and choose a primary school, knowing that his lineage was far from traditional. He wasn't even originally from this world. For years drifted by in that manner. Eventually, he crossed paths with Kadia Flameheart. She was the former mistress of the now-fallen House Flameheart, a viscounty that had lost its standing. Despite her house's fall, she was a noble-born 3-star mage, a status that made her highly sought after by various mercenary groups. While staying in the town of Edelstein, Kadia took on contracts through the Balaun Mercenary Corps. It was there that she became a mentor to the boy, who had joined the Corps at a young age and was already utilizing basic 1-star magic. Under her guidance, he learned a great deal from the experienced 3-star mage, honing the skills that his mysterious origins had granted him. Inside the Belden's Tear tavern, the warm, amber glow of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floorboards. Derek sat across from a stern yet composed woman, her dark hair streaked with subtle hints of red. It's only natural for a mage to develop a desire to rise higher, she began, her voice steady and instructional. And Derek, as you know, you have that kind of talent. She leaned forward slightly, her expression hardening with a touch of caution. With that being said, excessive greed will only slow your progress. Derek lowered his gaze, his silver hair catching the light. Yes, I'll keep that in mind, he replied quietly, his red eyes reflecting a quiet intensity. The woman stood and adjusted her cloak, shifting the conversation from philosophy to practice. Now, close your eyes and feel your mana, she commanded. Derek obeyed, shutting his eyes tight as he focused inward. He could feel the hum of energy beneath his skin. Calmly sense where it's generated, what kind of flow it has, she guided him, her eyes tracking his every movement. And think of it as using mana to bring the image you're imagining into reality. As Derek concentrated, a faint, ethereal blue light began to radiate from his body. Wisps of mana swirled around him like cold fire, responding to his mental command. The woman watched him closely, her sharp eyes noting the ease with which the energy manifested. He definitely has a considerable amount of innate mana, she thought to herself, impressed by the raw power radiating from the young man. And maybe it's because he's got a lot of field experience, but his mana control is stable as well. Derek concentrated, his brow furrowing as a surge of blue mana began to crackle and swirl around his body. Across from him, the woman watched with an intense, calculating gaze, her eyes narrowing as she monitored the sudden spike in his energy. Suddenly, a deafening explosion ripped through the air, the force of it rocking the Belden's Tear tavern to its foundations. Dust and debris rained down as the peaceful atmosphere shattered instantly. Inside the common room, panic erupted. What's that sound? A man shouted, his mouth agape in terror. Another cried out, what's going on, as people scrambled for cover. The air filled with frantic orders, are we under attack, and, go check outside. Amidst the chaos, Derek snapped out of his trance, his red eyes wide with confusion as he stared at his own hands, still wreathed in fading mana. Before he could process what had happened, his mentor reached out and grabbed his wrist firmly. Master, Derek stammered. Derek, don't say anything and just follow me, she commanded, her tone brooked no argument. She began pulling him through the tavern, heading for the exit. As they stepped out into the narrow alleyway, they passed groups of armed men and townspeople who were already mobilizing. What is it? Is there an attack? I heard something explode, one man called out, brandishing a spear. Another urged caution, shouting, watch carefully, I'm sure it was an explosion. Ignoring the growing commotion, the woman led Derek deeper into the alley, her pace quick and purposeful. Derek followed closely behind, his mind racing with questions as they moved further away from the scene of the blast. Master, he whispered, but she remained silent, leading him toward the unknown. The sun dipped low, casting long, amber shadows across the alley as Kadia turned back toward the young boy. Her expression was uncharacteristically somber, her voice dropping to a cautious whisper. Derek, listen carefully to what I'm about to say, she began, her eyes scanning the surroundings. Derek looked up, his crimson eyes focused and wary. Yes, he replied simply. Kadia sighed, her gaze hardening. As you know, nobles are sensitive about their privileges, and magic is the greatest privilege among them. People treat innate strength like a blessing, but that only applies to nobles. Among commoners, very rarely, someone reaches 3 stars, but usually, those are commoners who devoted their entire lives to magic. She stepped closer, the weight of her next words hanging heavy in the air. And what you just used, was a 2-star delusion-type spell called Auditory Hallucination. Derek remained silent, processing the gravity of her revelation. Internally, a blue system interface flickered to life before his eyes, confirming the feat. You're able to begin using 2-star magic. You've obtained auditory hallucination, a 2-star magic. That was the moment everything changed. At just 14 years old, Derek had become a 2-star mage, a feat that defied the natural order of their world. In the weeks that followed, Kadia remained by his side. As they traveled together, she became more than just a companion, she became a mentor. She passed down various spells, honing his raw talent into something lethal and precise. Between lessons, she shared fragments of her past, teaching him the complex etiquette and lethal politics of the high society she once belonged to when she was still a noble. A year passed in that rhythm of study and travel, but eventually, the time came for Kadia to depart. Derek learned that the county of Elvester had appointed her as a private tutor. It was a prestigious position. House Elvester was a family of such standing that even the capital's Grand Duke treated them with respect, bolstered by the presence of Count Elvester on their side. For Kadia, the appointment was an offer she simply couldn't refuse. Becoming a magic teacher for a noble of that caliber was considered an enormous blessing for anyone. Before she left, Kadia gave Derek a parting gift, a 2-star spellbook. As she boarded her carriage and waved a final goodbye, Derek was left with the weight of that book and the knowledge she had instilled in him. Another year went by. During that time, Derek dedicated himself to self-study, poring over the pages Kadia had left behind. Through sheer persistence, he managed to master 2 more 2-star spells, further cementing his quiet rise in power. At just 16 years old, he had already carved out a reputation for himself, yet his internal drive remained insatiable. He had no intention of stopping his climb. The heavy wooden door of the tavern, Belden's Tear, creaked as a young man with striking silver hair and crimson eyes sat at the bar. Across the counter, the tavern keeper leaned in, his expression alive with uncharacteristic excitement. "Ruan, we finally got a proper request for once," he announced, his voice booming in the quiet room. Ruan didn't look up immediately, his tone level. "What kind of request?" "It's a request from Mount Duplain, the Grand Duchy," the man replied, a grin spreading across his bearded face. "Do you understand what that means?" The name hung in the air, thick with weight. Ruan's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the gravity of the client. "Duplain, that Duplain." He paused, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face. "But why would a place like that hire us?" The tavern keeper's excitement boiled over into frustration at the boy's hesitation. He grabbed Ruan by the cloak, pulling him slightly forward as if to shake some sense into him. "Hey, you idiot. Is that what matters right now?" he barked. To emphasize his point, he gestured wildly, imagining the gold that would soon follow. "It's Duplain. Duplain, you know. Duplain uses gold like people use water." He let go of Ruan's cloak but kept his gaze intense. "And listen, if we open a path with Duplain through this job, we can build connections for next time, too." Ruan smoothed his cloak, his expression returning to its usual calm, analytical state. "So what do they want us to do?" The man straightened up, leaning back over the bar with a confident shrug. "Nothing crazy. They want us to subdue a few monsters on the outskirts of the Grand Duke's territory." Ruan looked at him, skeptical of such a simple task coming from such a powerful house. "That's it?" "Of course," the tavern keeper scoffed, waving off the doubt with a grin. "You think nobles would go back on their word?" Derek rested his chin on his hand, his brow furrowed in deep thought as he processed the tavern keeper's words. "TSK, something feels off," he muttered, his crimson eyes reflecting a sharp skepticism. It didn't make sense to him that a family as prestigious as Duplain would reach out to a mere mercenary corps just to clear out a few monsters. Suspicious of the hidden strings attached to such an easy request, he stood up and began to walk away. "I'm not doing it," he stated firmly. "Get someone else." The man at the bar panicked, shouting after him as Derek reached the door, "Hey, Derek. Wait a second." Derek didn't stop, offering only a cold glance over his shoulder. "Just call someone else. You know I don't take shady jobs." Desperate to keep his best lead from walking out, the tavern keeper pleaded, "Hey, if I could get someone else, I'd do it myself." He explained that the Duplains had a specific requirement: they needed a mage. "Don't you know mages are scarce among mercenary corps these days?" he yelled, leaning over the counter. "You're the only one who can do it, so I called you." Derek paused, his back still turned, but his voice remained laced with doubt. "Why do you need a mage just to kill a few monsters?" Despite the explanation, he wasn't convinced. "Regardless, I don't want to get tangled up in something unnecessary." Seeing the job slipping away, the man played his final card. He reached out and slammed a heavy, glittering coin onto the wood. 1 gold coin, he declared, his eyes gleaming with intensity. As Derek looked back, the man added, "This isn't even the fee. It's an advance payment." Derek stopped in his tracks, his gaze falling to the gold coin now resting in his palm. The weight of the currency seemed to ground his wandering thoughts as he stared at the payment in silence. The dispatch officer's eyes narrowed as they swept over the group, lingering with sharp disapproval on the youngest member. Beside him, a woman in a modest gray dress and a mysterious figure shrouded in a deep blue hood stood in silence, waiting for the introduction. "Derek, pay your respects," the rugged man beside the boy urged, resting a steadying hand on the youth's shoulder. "These are your clients." The dispatch officer didn't wait for a greeting. "Absolutely not," he barked, his voice dripping with incredulity. He adjusted his monocle, leaning in to peer at the silver-haired boy with blatant skepticism. "A child who hasn't even had his coming-of-age ceremony. I heard you ranked high in the Dawn War, so I had some expectations, but I can't believe you're sending a child like this on a job." The man beside the boy held up a hand, his expression earnest as he tried to bridge the gap. "And no, dispatch officer, this kid is the real deal. He's the best mage I know." The dismissal. He turned on his heel, his coattails snapping with the sudden movement. "Let's go. This isn't a task to entrust to some child," he muttered, signaling to the woman in gray that the meeting was over. As the officer began to walk away, the woman followed, though she cast a lingering, uncertain look back over her shoulder. The hooded figure remained still, their face hidden in shadow, watching the exchange with unreadable intent. Behind them, the boy, Derek, stood perfectly still. His crimson eyes, sharp and unnervingly calm for someone his age, locked onto the retreating back of the man who had just insulted his capability. "Derek, was it?" the officer repeated quietly, though his voice carried a weight that halted the air in the room. He looked directly at the boy, his expression cool and focused. He said, "Let's talk." In the rolling, verdant hills of the Grand Duchy of Duplain, the silence of the landscape was shattered by the sudden, violent clash of steel and magic. A goblin was sent hurtling through the air, its body reeling from a forceful impact that sent it tumbling across the grass. The silver-haired boy moved with a lethal, focused grace, his red eyes narrowed as he closed the distance. With a singular, decisive strike, he sliced through the creature, leaving a spray of dark blood in his wake. He didn't stop there. As another goblin lunged from behind with a guttural roar, the boy pivoted instantly. He met the monster's overhead swing with a devastating counterslash that cut deep into its torso, silencing its cry before it could fully land its blow. The boy stood over the fallen monsters, his face partially cast in shadow, splattered with the remnants of the skirmish. To ensure the threat was thoroughly neutralized, a surge of brilliant blue arcane energy erupted from his form, crackling across the clearing. He turned back toward the onlookers, his expression cool and entirely unshaken by the violence. "It's all finished, dispatch officer," he stated calmly, the blue light finally fading as he looked toward the man who had doubted him. The dispatch officer stood frozen, his arms crossed over his chest as he stared at the carnage littering the hills of the Grand Duchy of Duplain. The skepticism that had previously defined his face was replaced by a look of sheer bewilderment. "Oh, great," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "You took down that many in no time." Beside him, the hooded woman watched Derek with a faint, enigmatic smile playing on her lips, her eyes obscured by the shadow of her cowl. Later that evening, the group returned to the warmth of Tavern Belden's tier. "So you became a noble's dog, Derek?" a blonde woman, Pelion, shouted, slamming her hands onto a table. Her face was contorted with indignation, her eyes flashing with anger. "Pelion, get down, what are you doing?" "These are customers," the man beside Derek hissed, trying to pull her back. But Pelion was far from finished. She leaned over the table, teeth gritted. "No matter how lowly us commoners are, we must not become a noble's dog." She turned her gaze back to the man, demanding answers. "Derek didn't tell you how much this job pays, did he? How much? How much did they offer that he'd throw away his pride and crawl between a noble's legs?" The man sighed, looking slightly exasperated. "Crawling between their legs isn't part of the job though." "What? 1 silver, she guessed, her voice dripping with disdain. The man held up a single finger, a knowing smirk spreading across his face. 1 gold. The change in Pelion was instantaneous. Her eyes widened into shimmering saucers of greed, her anger vanishing as if it had never existed. "Then please let me crawl between their legs too," she yelled, her voice echoing through the tavern. "Will you shut up?" the man barked, his face turning red with embarrassment. "I said crawling between their legs isn't part of the job." Later that night at the tavern, the initial chaos settled into a weary quiet. Helyun, her greed apparently sated by the mere mention of gold, lay face down on the wooden table, fast asleep and drooling. The man, Jaffrin, leaned against the bar, nursing a drink as he looked at Derek. "So, how was the request?" Jaffrin asked, his voice low. Derek sat composed, his expression neutral. "It was nothing special. We just killed a few goblins and it was over," he replied. Jaffrin nodded, though his eyes remained sharp. "Their first appearance was trash, but didn't they look like they had money?" Derek's red eyes shifted as he stared into the middle distance, his mind replaying the afternoon's oddities. "They did, but, all three of them were lying," he said firmly. When Jaffrin reacted with a surprised "really?" Derek began to deconstruct the charade. He explained that the noble lineage Jaffrin was looking for possessed three distinct traits: fame, wealth, and overwhelming ability. Yet, in Derek's estimation, the man they met possessed none of those things. His suspicions didn't end with the dispatch officer, and the woman who called herself a scullery maid. Derek noted, recalling how she had handed over the payment. Her hands were far too clean for someone doing rough work. He then trailed off, his gaze hardening as he thought of the final member of the party, and that trained instructor. "Derek," Jaffrin interrupted, his tone turning stern and businesslike. He looked the young mage in the eye, his face set in a grim mask. "We're mercenaries. We don't need to dig too deeply into our clients. We just do the job and take the money. That's all." Derek went silent for a moment, absorbing the veteran's advice. "All right," he finally conceded. He knew Jaffrin was right about the nature of their world. This place was the wild, and in the wild, the only thing that truly mattered was making a living. Everything else, the lies, the disguises, and the hidden agendas, simply didn't matter. The following day, the group returned to the rolling fields of the Grand Duchy of Duplain. The landscape was littered with the bodies of fallen monsters, a testament to the young mage's efficiency. "It's all taken care of," Derek announced, his voice flat as he looked over the aftermath. "With this, goblins won't be showing up for a while." Jaffrin beamed, clapping a hand on the boy's shoulder. Good, great work." He turned to the dispatch officer with a triumphant grin. "Now then, how shall we receive the remaining payment?" The dispatch officer watched as the scullery maid handed over 2 glittering gold coins. Jaffrin's eyes nearly popped out of his head as he held them up to the light, the gold reflecting a brilliant glow. "Derek! Look at this. 2 gold coins. Twice. With this much gold, we could." "Let's put that down and talk," Derek interrupted, his eyes fixed on the dispatch officer, who was currently lost in thought. The officer adjusted his monocle, his gaze heavy and serious as he looked at the boy he had once dismissed as a mere child. "Derek, I value your skills highly," he began, his voice carrying a new weight of respect. "I'd like to present you with a personal request. Will you accept it?" Jaffrin froze, his hand still resting on Derek's head. "Pardon?" The officer didn't blink. "For this request, the Grand Duchy will pay 10 gold coins." The silence that followed was broken only by Jaffrin's strangled cry of disbelief. "What? 10 coins?" The dispatch officer ignored the older mercenary, leaning in slightly toward the youth. "Will you do it?" Derek didn't hesitate. His crimson eyes met the officer's steady gaze with a cold, unwavering focus. "Yes." The carriage jolted to a halt as they arrived at the grand estate of Captain Duplain. Jackson stepped out, squinting at the sheer scale of the residence. "Mister, all this is indeed the Grand Duke Duplain's home," he remarked, his voice carrying a mix of awe and lingering skepticism. "Before we go in, I should properly introduce myself." His companion, however, was already moving forward. "Just come on," he started, only to be cut off by Jackson's frantic whisper. "Wait. We've only met once or twice. Please talk to me comfortably." Their bickering was interrupted by a stern-looking man wearing a monocle. "I am Delon, the Grand Steward serving Grand Duke Duplain," he announced with practiced formality. "I apologize for being unable to greet you personally due to the nature of my work." Jackson swallowed hard, his bravado momentarily failing him. "Wait, oh my. What do we do now?" A woman standing nearby offered a polite smile. "I am Katarina, the Grand Duke's head maid." Jackson quickly tried to recover his composure, offering a respectful nod. "Oh my, such noble people of such high standing are here. My greetings, Sir Delon. I'm Jackson, captain of the Belkan Mercenary Corps. The young man with silver hair watched the exchange silently, his mind racing. So he wasn't a district officer but the grand steward, and she wasn't a factory maid but the head maid? He observed their polished movements and refined speech. I more or less expected this, but their ranks are pretty high. Then, his gaze shifted. A figure approached, the air around her seemingly shifting with her presence. As she pulled back her hood, long dark hair cascaded down, and striking blue eyes met his. I am Adeline Eleanor Duplain, she said, her voice clear and commanding. I want to appoint you as the magic tutor for my younger sister, Delia. The young man stared at her, caught completely off guard. A magic tutor for a noble lady. The sun hung high over the sprawling Duplain residence in the Grand Duchy of Duplain, its ivory spires reaching toward a clear blue sky. On the surface, the estate appeared the picture of noble tranquility, but inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. The heavy, ornate doors of the study burst open with a resounding thud. Reg marched into the room, his face flushed with indignation. He didn't wait for an invitation, his eyes locking onto the two men already seated in the cavernous, sun-drenched hall. Father, Valerian, please take a look at this, Reg demanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. At the far end of the room, his father sat behind a massive desk, his expression hardening as he looked up from his paperwork. He didn't rise, instead fixing Reg with a cold, piercing stare. Beside him sat Valerian, composed and silent. What do you think you're doing, Reg? His father asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Conduct yourself with dignity. Reg didn't flinch. If anything, the reprimand only stoked his fire. He gestured sharply to the young maid trembling behind him, her head bowed in shame and distress. The one who needs to act with dignity isn't me, but Daila. Reg countered, his voice rising in pitch. She's going too far, and now she's even laying hands on the people I hired. The maid's eyes welled with tears as she stood caught in the crossfire of the family's tension. Valerian, his blonde hair catching the light, narrowed his eyes slightly. He looked more inconvenienced by the volume of the conversation than the subject matter. Lower your voice, Reg, Valerian interrupted smoothly, though his tone held a sharp edge. Father and I are in the middle of a conversation. More than 10 servants quit just last month. Reg shouted, ignoring his brother's dismissal. He paced the rug, his gestures becoming more erratic as he pointed toward the door to emphasize the exodus of the household staff. Not to mention she punishes them cruelly whenever she feels like it. Reg leaned heavily over the desk, his shadow stretching toward his father, who remained unnervingly still. How long are you going to keep turning a blind eye to that thug, father? He demanded, the frustration in his voice reaching a boiling point. The sharp, authoritative snap of a name cut through the air. Valerian had risen from his seat, his tall frame cutting a stark, white silhouette against the blue hues of the study. He looked at his brother with a mixture of fatigue and stern warning. That's enough. Stop it and leave, he commanded, his blue eyes cold and unwavering. Reg fell silent, his jaw tightening as he looked away, but the fire in his eyes had not been extinguished. He wasn't finished. Father, even if Daila is a good-for-nothing, don't we still have Eislein? As he spoke, an image of a gentle, dark-haired woman flickered in his mind, a stark contrast to the chaos he was describing. I think it's time we let Daila go, Reg continued, his gaze narrowing as he leaned back into the shadows of his own resolve. His father's response was immediate and icy. That isn't for you to decide, Reg. Reg pressed on, revealing how far he had already gone to see his plan through. I had the Grand Steward look into a monastery, he admitted, his profile sharp against the light. They say the facilities are good, plenty of children of nobles come and go as well. He spoke with a clinical detachment now, trying to frame his desire to remove her as an act of mercy. Instead of living while being treated like a burden, wouldn't it be better for Daila to devote herself to God's will? If leaving her be will bring great trouble to the family, then it'd be better to. He never finished the sentence. With a sudden, explosive movement, the Grand Duke's hand shot out, grabbing Reg by the hair and slamming his head down onto the hard surface of the desk. The crack of impact echoed through the hall. I believe I told you that's not your decision to make, the Duke growled, his face illuminated by a hellish, reddish glow of pure rage as he pinned his son down. Reg. Blood pooled near Reg's mouth as he lay pinned, gasping for air. Even in his defeated state, his conviction remained. When the time comes to decide, you must decide, father. He wheezed out. The Duke stared down at him, his expression an unreadable mask of cold power. Elsewhere in the estate, while the storm raged in the study, Aisline walked through the sunlit corridors with a silver-haired companion. The atmosphere here was light, a world away from the violence in the Duke's office. "Have you ever heard about my younger sister, Daila?" Aisline asked softly. The young man nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen Lady Daila in the Duplain family's registry." Aisline offered a small, bittersweet smile, her eyes downcast. "Yes, that's right. She's probably not well known to the public." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the heavy doors at the end of the hall swinging open. Valerian emerged, guiding a battered rag, who was clutching a cloth to his head. "V. Valerian," Aisline stammered, surprised. "Oh, Aisline. It's been a while," Valerian said, his voice regaining its cool silkiness. "How was your experience in Ebelstein?" "Thanks to your care, I've been living comfortably," she replied with a gentle smile. Valerian gestured to the limping rag. "I see. As you can see, Rag is a bit hurt, so let's catch up later." As they parted, the silver-haired boy's gaze lingered. His red eyes sharpened, trailing over the retreating brothers and then settling on a distraught maid nearby. There was an inscrutable intensity in his stare before he followed Aisline into the Duke's presence. Inside the study, the Duke had regained his seat. "I'm relieved to hear you've been doing well in Ebelstein," he said to Aisline. "It's all thanks to you, Father," she replied gracefully. She then gestured to the quiet boy at her side. "Oh, this is the magic tutor I brought from Ebelstein. He said he'd take charge of Daila." The Duke adjusted his glasses, his gaze turning to the young man. I see. I assume you're busy, so we'll take our leave," Aisline said, preparing to depart. "You there, stay behind," the Duke commanded, stopping the tutor in his tracks. The boy paused, his expression unreadable. Once they were alone, the Duke returned to his writing before looking up with a piercing gaze. "You're quite young. 16, you said?" the Duke asked. "Yes," the boy replied, sitting composed on the sofa. "Can you handle magic to some extent?" "I can use a bit of one-star magic," the boy answered simply. A low, dry chuckle escaped the Duke. "Ho ho ho. You have no reason to lie," he said, his eyes narrowing with a dangerous edge. "Humility doesn't always come off as a sign of virtue." The boy felt the Duke's overwhelming 5-star mana radiating through the room like blue flames. "I guess humility won't work on an 5-star mage," he thought. He bowed his head slightly. "I apologize if I came off as disrespectful." The Duke waved it off, noting that being too talented can eat away at a person. "Judging by your age and attire, you don't look like someone suited to be a magic tutor," the Duke observed. "I'm a mercenary," the boy admitted. The Duke accepted this, deciding not to pry since Aisline had chosen him. "I'll grant you entry to the annex of the residence where Daila lives. Have a maid guide you. You may go now." As the boy turned to leave, he paused. "May I ask you one thing?" "Go on," the Duke replied, his gaze already returning to his work. "I'm a mercenary, Your Grace," he began, his expression unreadable. "If I take a commission, it is my duty to see it through." The Duke leaned back, his bearded face etched with a mixture of skepticism and boredom. The young man continued, outlining the parameters of his task, "so that Lady Daila may learn magic, and enter high society as a proper noble. Lady Anseling commissioned me." The Duke's eyes narrowed behind his spectacles. "Why are you spelling out the obvious?" he countered, his tone dry. He wasn't one for redundant recitations of facts he already knew. "Because I have an earnest request to make of you, Your Grace," the mercenary replied, his crimson eyes locking onto the Duke's with sudden intensity. The Duke paused, a single, silent question mark hanging in the air between them. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the estate, the sound of shattering porcelain tore through the quiet of the hallway. A plate soared through the air and collided with the floor, exploding into a dozen sharp fragments near the feet of a trembling maid. "Kadia," the girl gasped, recoiling as the shards skittered across the polished wood. She dropped to a deep, frantic bow, her voice shaking with terror. "I'm sorry. I sincerely apologize, Miss Daila." Above her stood a figure in a crimson skirt, radiating a cold, sharp-edged fury. Daila didn't offer a hand or a word of forgiveness. Instead, her voice cut through the air like a whip. "You're sorry," Daila sneered, her eyes downcast in disdain. "Do you think that, given your status, apologizing will change anything?" The maid remained frozen, eyes wide with fear as the verbal assault continued. "Get out of my sight right now," Daila commanded, her tone dropping to a dangerous hiss. In a quiet corner of the estate, tea sat cooling in a delicate blue and gold porcelain cup as a conversation of high stakes and hidden pasts unfolded. The man sitting across from Lady Anseline leaned forward, his brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "Why Derek, of all people?" he asked, noting that magic tutors of high standing should have been lining up for a position at Duplain. He pointed out the harsh reality of their world. A commoner would always struggle to command respect as a noble's magic tutor. Lady Anseline looked down, her blue eyes clouded with the memory of past failures. "I think I've tried almost every famous magic master on the entire continent," she admitted softly. In the end, they all gave up. Driven by desperation, she explained that she had begun seeking those who possessed magic but were trapped in dire straits. Despite his background as a mercenary, Derek had caught her eye. He seemed to possess a rare understanding of noble etiquette and culture, a polish she attributed to his master, a fallen noble who had once been quite successful. "I see. I figured he was refined and kind despite being a mercenary," Anseline continued, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. "I thought that if it were him, he might be able to gently rein Dyla in and lead her." Her companion let out a soft, knowing chuckle that made her pause. "Ho ho, Lady Anseline, you need to learn how to see through people better." "Pardon?" she asked, her smile faltering. The man's expression hardened, his gaze becoming piercing as he revealed the true nature of the man she had hired. "Derek is a mage who grew up on the streets," he stated flatly. He explained that Derek had been a mercenary before he had even reached adulthood. "Do you think someone from the streets can survive from nothing but refinement and kindness?" he challenged. Anseline could only stare back, the weight of his words shifting her entire perspective on the man now tasked with tutoring Dyla. Meanwhile, Derek moved through the grand hallways of the estate, his boots clicking softly on the patterned carpet as he left the Duke's presence. He reached a large, ornate set of double doors and paused. With a steady hand, he knocked twice, the sound echoing in the quiet corridor. After a moment of silence, he reached for the handle and pushed the door open. "Greetings," he said softly as he stepped into the room. Across the floor, a young woman sat in a chair by the window, her back turned to him. "My name is Derek. Please excuse me for a moment," he introduced himself. The woman, identified as Dyla Catherine Duplain, the second daughter of House Duplain, did not turn around. "Come closer," she commanded, her voice cold and imperious. As Derek began to walk toward her, Dyla remained still, her face hidden in shadow as she waited for the commoner who dared to be her tutor. As Derek began to walk toward her, Dyla's lips curled into a cruel, sudden smirk. Without warning, a heavy splash erupted through the air. A bucket of foul liquid was dumped directly over Derek, drenching his silver hair and soaking through his cloak. He stood frozen, his eyes closed as the dirty water dripped from his face. "Oh, my! This is horrible!" Dyla exclaimed, her voice dripping with mock concern as she stood before him, the empty bucket discarded on the floor. She looked him up and down with a sneer. "I thought some sewer rat had come in." She circled him slowly, her eyes bright with malice. "Are you the mercenary the Grand Steward mentioned?" she asked, before answering her own question with a biting laugh. "Or maybe not. Looking at you again, maybe you really are a sewer rat." Dyla stepped onto a small stool to loom over him, grabbing another container. "Well, I prepared this for you. Does it bring back memories of your hometown?" she taunted. She tipped the vessel, pouring more filth over his head. "Being drenched in gutter water suits you so much better." Derek remained silent, his expression unreadable beneath the grime. Seeing his lack of reaction, Dyla let out a sharp, annoyed huff. "Ah, my. I ran out of water." Only a sigh. "Well, this is disappointing," she muttered, staring at the man who refused to give her the satisfaction of a plea or a protest. Rain-like sweat beaded on the young man's forehead as he looked up, his crimson eyes wide with a mix of exhaustion and sudden apprehension. He barely had time to process the situation before the blonde girl before him reacted with visceral disgust. "Huh?" she muttered, her blue eyes narrowing as if she were looking at something repulsive. The air shifted instantly. "How dare you look at me?" she shrieked. With a sharp, sudden movement, she lashed out, her boot connecting squarely with his chest. The force of the kick sent him reeling backward, his body hitting the floor with a heavy thud. He collapsed into a crouch, gasping for breath as he tried to steady himself against the polished tiles. The girl didn't let up. She looked down at him with a sneer, her posture rigid with aristocratic disdain. "Damn it," she hissed, covering her nose with a gloved hand. "You stink." She moved closer, her shadow looming over him as he remained grounded, unable to reclaim his footing. With a practiced air of superiority, she pressed her foot down onto him, asserting her dominance. The boy could only stare at the floor, his silver hair falling over his face as he endured the humiliation. She leaned back slightly, a cruel, mocking smile spreading across her lips as she looked down at the sewer rat beneath her. "Know your place," she commanded, her voice dripping with venom. "Someone like you teaching me? Did they not teach you common sense on the street?" Within the quiet gravity of a sun-drenched study, a man stood by the window, his gaze fixed on the world outside. He turned, his face etched with the weight of responsibility and a hint of weariness. Across from him sat the silver-haired young man, his posture deceptively calm despite the intensity in his crimson eyes. "The fact that I'm here means Lady Diela's problem can't be easily resolved," the young man stated, his voice steady. He looked directly at the older man, acknowledging the other's position. "I have to ask your grace, who loves Lady Diela more than anyone else, how much authority you're willing to grant me when it comes to teaching Lady Diela." The older man, framed by his spectacles and a sharp beard, watched him with a calculating, heavy silence. The memory of the encounter shifted the air. Back in the room, the dynamic had fractured with a sharp, echoing crack. Diela's face was flushed a deep, indignant red, her hand flying to her cheek in stunned silence. She had been knocked to the floor, her aristocratic poise shattered as she stared up at her supposed teacher. The young man stood over her, his shadow stretching long across the tiles. There was no hesitation in his stance, only a cold, focused resolve. He looked down at her, his red eyes gleaming with a frightening intensity that brooked no further insults or resistance. The sewer rat she had so casually dismissed now held the absolute power in the room, his presence looming as a silent answer to the authority he had demanded from her father. 3 years ago, under a bright, sprawling sky, a horse-drawn carriage rattled along a dirt path flanked by lush greenery. On the back of the cart, a young boy with white hair sat beside his teacher, a woman with dark hair and a composed, scholarly air. The boy broke the silence, his brow furrowed with a heavy question. "Teacher," he began, "if you had to teach a stubborn student who didn't appreciate kindness, what would you do?" The teacher stared out at the passing landscape, her hand resting thoughtfully against her chin. Well, I suppose I'd try to understand them, embrace them, and take them in." The boy's expression darkened, his crimson eyes reflecting a deep-seated skepticism. "Isn't that too idealistic?" he countered, leaning forward with intensity. "What about a student you can't even do that with?" She turned toward him, her gaze gentle yet firm. "The essence of teaching is to lead a student in a better direction," she explained. "If you can't communicate through understanding and acceptance, then you'll have to find a different starting point." The boy looked up, curious. "A different starting point? What is that?" The teacher leaned in, her eyes narrowing as a shadow of cold intensity crossed her face. She tapped her temple with a finger, her voice dropping to a chilling, authoritative tone. "By carving fear into them." The memory faded, replaced by the harsh reality of the present. The white-haired boy, now older and draped in a dark cloak, stood tall in a grand, sunlit room. Before him, a blonde girl cowered on the floor, her face pale and her eyes wide with genuine terror. She trembled under the weight of his presence, the echoes of his teacher's philosophy manifesting in his cold, uncompromising gaze. "Treat others with consideration and respect," he commanded, his voice echoing off the high ceilings like a gavel. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. Instead, he looked down at her with a chilling indifference. "Don't make me say things twice. Get up." The initial shock on the girl's face quickly curdled into a sharp, indignant rage. She scrambled up from the floor, her movements frantic as she lunged toward the white-haired young man. Her hand swung through the air, aimed squarely at his face, but the strike connected. "How dare the likes of you," she hissed, her blue eyes blazing with fury as she struggled against his hold. "You dare lay a hand on." A sharp crack echoed through the room as he delivered a stinging slap across her cheek. Her head snapped to the side, her golden hair whipping across her face. She stood frozen, a crimson welt beginning to bloom on her skin, her eyes wide with disbelief. He looked down at her, his red eyes cold and devoid of pity. "I won't make you say things twice either," he stated, his voice a low, steady threat. "When you deal with others, you will do so with consideration and respect." The girl let out a breathless, mocking laugh. "Ha!" She turned her head, looking past him toward the entrance of the hall. "Grand Steward, what are you doing?" she shrieked, her voice reaching a frantic pitch. This lowborn dared to put his hands on a young lady. A middle-aged man in a formal tuxedo burst into the room, followed closely by several panicked maids. His face was a mask of sheer terror as he rushed toward the scene. "Lady Dibla, are you all right?" he cried out, his eyes darting between the trembling girl and the silent, silver-haired figure who stood over her. He turned his fury on the boy, his monocle glinting. "What do you think you're doing right now? How dare you lay a hand on the young lady? If the Grand Duke finds out." Unfazed, the boy reached into his cloak and pulled out a rolled parchment. He held it out for the steward to see, his expression unchanging. "His Grace has granted me full authority over all of Miss Dibla's education." He unrolled the document, revealing a wax seal and formal calligraphy. "His Grace has permitted me to employ whatever method I choose." The steward adjusted his monocle, his hands trembling as he scanned the text. This. He trailed off, the weight of the Duke's signature silencing his protests. Beside him, Lady Dibla stared at the paper in stunned silence, the realization of her new reality finally sinking in. Later that night, under the cold glow of a full moon, the peace of the manor was shattered once more. A tall man with long blonde hair and a regal military uniform stormed through the corridors. An aide trailed behind him, desperate to hold him back. Valerian, please calm down." He didn't listen. He kicked the double doors open with a violent crash, his face twisted in a snarl of protective rage. "So you're the mercenary," he bellowed, his eyes searching for the boy who had dared to touch his kin. Charging into the room where the boy was quietly holding a small book. Before the boy could react, Valerian lunged forward, grabbing him by the collar of his tunic and hoisting him partially off his seat. "How dare you hit Dibla?" he roared. Raid rushed in, placing a hand on Valerian's shoulder to steady him. "Valerian, put that down and talk." The boy remained eerily calm, his red eyes looking up at the enraged nobleman without a flicker of fear. "It's something His Grace permitted," he said evenly. Raid sighed, trying to de-escalate the tension. "Valerian, he's a guest Asseline brought. If you act like this, what will that do to Asseline's position?" He leaned in closer to Valerian. "Father allowed it too, didn't he?" Valerian let out a frustrated huff, finally releasing his grip on the boy's shirt. He straightened his own uniform, though his eyes remained sharp. "You, come with me," he commanded the boy. He glanced back at his aide. "Raid, don't interfere. Go attend to your own matters." As Valerian led the boy away, Raid watched them go, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He placed a hand on his chest, thinking back to the afternoon's events. "I heard about what happened," Raid murmured to himself. "Dibla does need a beating before she comes to her senses." "Don't worry, Valerian won't go too far." He watched the silver-haired boy follow the knight down the dark hall. "Geez, I don't know why he's protecting that hopeless one." Valerian led the boy to a quiet wing of the mansion. He stopped before a pair of heavy doors and pushed them open. "Come in," he muttered. The room was filled with shadows and covered in dust, though it felt oddly preserved. Dolls sat on chairs, and paintings were stacked against the walls. "This is the room Dibla used when she stayed in the main house," Valerian explained softly, his anger replaced by a weary nostalgia. "It's been left like this ever since." The boy walked deeper into the room, his eyes falling on an unfinished landscape on an easel. "Dibla used to love drawing," Valerian continued. "Every time she asked me to look at her drawings, her face would turn red. She was so adorable." He paused, looking at the half-painted canvas. "But she never finished a drawing. Most of the time, she'd leave a blank space and only draw the parts she liked." Valerian turned to the boy, his expression softening into an apology. "About earlier, I'm sorry I got emotional. I apologize for that." "Don't worry about it," the boy replied, his voice neutral. He looked around the room, the clutter of a lost childhood surrounding him. "But why did you bring me to this room?" "I wanted to show you," Valerian said, his voice heavy. "That Dibla wasn't a child who deserved to be despised or beaten." He looked away, his gaze distant. "But at some point, she started obsessing excessively over bloodline. And in the end, she was driven out of the main house and locked away in the annex." The boy listened in silence, his eyes fixed on the drawings. "I can't even guess what turned her into that," Valerian admitted. "We have to stop her from being sent to the monastery." He turned to the boy with a desperate look. "If she learns even one-star magic, I'll be able to persuade father somehow." He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his voice a plea. "I'm begging you, please save Dibla." The boy remained still for a moment, then his hand moved to a stack of books. "Wait," he murmured. He pulled a volume from the shelf, flipping through the pages. "She didn't completely give up on magic." Valerian blinked, surprised. "What?" "Judging by all the notes in the margins of these books," the boy said, his eyes scanning the dense text. "And those books over there are all theory books from the School of Regulations, right?" "Yeah, that's right, because nobles learn from the School of Regulations," Valerian confirmed, his voice trailing off. The boy's gaze sharpened, his mind working through the implications of the notes he found. He looked back at the unfinished painting, seeing the blank spaces in a new light. I'll give it a try, he decided. Deep in the night, the silence of Lady Dibla's annex was shattered. She was sound asleep until a sudden, freezing deluge of water struck her face. "Kya," she screamed, bolting upright in bed, drenched and shivering. Standing over her was the white-haired boy, an empty wooden bucket in his hands. "Are you seriously falling asleep right now?" he asked, his expression bored. "What?" she gasped, clutching her damp nightgown. Her eyes widened with terror as she recognized him. Are you out of your mind?" He didn't answer her. Instead, he reached out and grabbed her arm, dragging her bodily toward the door. "Come with me for a moment," he commanded. "There's somewhere we need to go." "Let go. How dare you touch me? Are you crazy?" she shrieked, digging her heels into the carpet. "Ow, that hurts. Let go. I'm not going with you." Despite her struggles, he pulled her out into the hallway. The maids watched in paralyzed shock as their mistress was hauled away by the mercenary. "What are you doing? Stop this lowborn," she cried out to them, but none dared to move against the man with the Grand Duke's authority. Under the pale glow of a full moon, with a sudden, rough movement, the boy released his grip, sending her tumbling to the ground. She scrambled into a sitting position, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and indignation. What do you think doing this would even change?" she stammered, her breath hitching. "Wake up from your dream. Who the hell are you to even treat me? You don't even listen. What to even do?" "There's no fact," he interrupted, his voice flat and chillingly calm. Dibla blinked, momentarily silenced by his tone. The boy looked down at her, the moonlight catching the crimson glint in his eyes. He raised a gloved hand, a dark, predatory smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Honestly, I don't have any intention of teaching you magic," he confessed. "I just like beating up stick-up nobles," he continued, his shadow looming large over her. The blood drained from Dibla's face. "What did you just say?" He took a slow step forward, the sound of his boots crushing the grass echoing in the silence. "Don't you agree? There's no reason for someone from the bottom to like nobles." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that made her skin crawl. "This tutor nonsense is all just an excuse." Wait, what are you talking about?" Dibla stammered, her body trembling as she tried to back away on the grass. The realization that her tormentor had no interest in her education left her truly defenseless. The moonlight filtered through the dense canopy, casting a cold, ethereal glow over the confrontation. He hovered over her, his eyes glinting with a sadistic fervor. "An excuse to beat up arrogant, high-and-mighty nobles, like you," he sneered, his voice dripping with long-held resentment. The girl lay on the forest floor, her breath hitching as she stared up at the man she once thought she knew. With a slow, deliberate motion, he drew his sword, the metallic shink echoed through the trees, a death knell in the silence. He leaned in closer, a dark smile playing on his lips. "Do you know how beautiful the screams of those oh-so-noble people are?" Panic surged through her. "Do you think you'll be safe after doing something like this?" she demanded, her voice trembling despite her attempt at defiance. "Safe, of course," he retorted with chilling nonchalance. He stood tall, the blade held casually at his side. "You're going to be shoved into a monastery soon anyway. Who would believe anything you say?" He chuckled, a hollow sound that sent shivers down her spine. "And if something really did happen, I can just apologize with my life." She stared at him in disbelief, her mind reeling. "A commoner's life is worth about 30 silver coins. Or I could just run away," he continued, his reflection staring back at her from the polished steel of his blade. "Wouldn't the Empire help me soon enough? I'd be doing Duplain a favor by getting rid of its headache, after all." He looked at her then, his gaze piercing and predatory. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't joking. He truly intended to end her life right here in the shadows. "If I get caught by him now, I'll die." Fear finally overrode her shock. She scrambled to her feet, her silk dress tearing against the underbrush as she bolted into the darkness. She didn't look back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, with only the sound of her own frantic footsteps and the terrifying knowledge that he was watching her run. Desperation fueled her every step as she dashed through the moonlit woods. "If I cut across the grassland toward the residence, he'll catch me right away," she thought, her breath hitching in her throat. Her only hope was the dense cover of the trees. She had to shake him off in the forest. If she could just lead him into the shadows, she might be the one to survive the night. Suddenly, a searing heat erupted behind her. She bolted, eyes wide with terror as a massive sphere of flame materialized in the air. She skidded to a halt, staring back in disbelief. Fireball. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Fireball was 2-star magic, a level of power that should have been impossible for the person chasing her. How can that bastard use 2-star magic? Standing at the edge of the clearing, the young man held his hand aloft, a second sun of swirling orange flame crackling in his palm. He wore a dark cloak that billowed slightly in the wind, his expression hidden in the shadows, save for a chilling, confident smirk. Without a word, he unleashed the spell. The fireball tore through the air with a deafening roar. She barely had time to scream, "Kyaa," before throwing herself to the ground. The projectile slammed into the earth just feet away, the resulting explosion sending a shockwave of dirt and heat over her trembling form. As the dust settled, she looked up, her face pale and coated in grime. A shadow loomed over her. The man stood there, his eyes glowing with an ominous, predatory red light. A cold, mocking smile played on his lips as he looked down at his prey. "I guess I missed," he murmured, his voice dripping with terrifying nonchalance. The moon hung high in the ink-blue sky, casting a cold, ethereal glow over the dense forest. Beneath the shadows of the towering trees, a young girl desperately sprinted through the underbrush. Her breath came in ragged, frantic gasps, huff, huff, as she pushed her body to its limit. The uneven ground was a treacherous maze of roots and low-hanging branches. Suddenly, her foot caught on a gnarled surface. With a sharp gasp, she lost her balance and tumbled forward, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. She lay there for a moment, grit and sweat clinging to her skin. "Ugh!" she groaned, her voice trembling as she struggled to push herself up from the forest floor. Her blonde hair fell over her face, damp and disheveled from the chase. Before she could fully regain her footing, a shrill, whistling sound sliced through the night air. Her eyes widened in terror as a streak of brilliant, translucent blue light tore across her vision. The projectile, a magical arrow, glowing with intense mana, hissed through the space where her head had been just seconds before. The impact, the arrow slammed into the earth inches from her hand, the sheer force of the impact kicking up dirt and emitting a low, hummed vibration. She froze, staring at the shimmering weapon embedded in the grass. A voice, calm and dangerously steady, drifted through the trees behind her. "You're pretty quick." The pursuer emerged from the darkness, a silver-haired young man draped in a dark cloak. Wisps of blue magical energy flickered around his hand like dying embers. He watched her with a detached sort of curiosity, adding, "It's hard to believe that speed belongs to someone who's been shut inside the annex all day." The girl didn't stay to listen. She scrambled to her feet and bolted again, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes on her retreating figure. As she ran, her mind raced even faster than her feet. "How long do I have to keep running?" she wondered, her chest burning with every jagged breath. "Can I even get away?" Panic threatened to swallow her whole. "At this rate, he'll definitely catch me." Behind her, the young man didn't seem to be in any rush. He knelt slowly, pressing a glowing, mana-infused hand against the damp earth. A ripple of blue light expanded from his touch, a tracking spell weaving through the roots and soil. He looked toward the deep woods where she had vanished, his red eyes sharp and knowing. He recognized the terrain. "That forest is the one I saw in the painting," he murmured to himself. A grim realization settled over him as he tracked her path. It must be where she's been running around since she was little. Without even realizing it, she had fallen right into his trap, her presence unintentionally drawn into his canvas. The white-haired boy watched her with cold, crimson eyes, his expression unreadable as he realized his plan was unfolding perfectly. "This is definitely," he began to muse, his voice trailing off as the tension reached its breaking point. Suddenly, a piercing scream tore through the air. "Aw!" The young girl, clad in a lavender dress, lunged forward in a desperate attempt to defend herself. Metal clashed against metal with a sharp clang as the boy effortlessly parried her strike, the sheer force of his counter sending a shockwave through the clearing. The girl fell back, gasping for air, her face twisted in a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. She looked up at him, her chest heaving as she struggled to find her footing. Standing over her with his blade drawn, the boy's gaze remained icy. "I'll admit that your spirit is admirable," he said, his voice calm despite the violence of their encounter. "Knowing it'd be hard to shake pursuit, you chose to strike back instead. That couldn't have been an easy decision." The girl could only offer ragged huffs of breath in response, her strength clearly failing. The boy stepped closer, the shadow of his cloak looming over her. "You don't even have the energy left to run anymore," he noted, his red eyes narrowing. He raised his sword, the cold moonlight glinting off the steel as he pointed the tip toward her. "Any last words?" A bitter, breathless laugh escaped her lips, a final flicker of defiance. What? Do you think I'm going to apologize? She spat, her blue eyes wide with a mix of terror and aristocratic pride. Even broken and cornered in the dirt, she refused to yield her dignity. Unlike you lowborns, I don't grovel. Just kill me. The white-haired boy looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the cool moonlight. Why are you so obsessed with bloodline? He asked, his voice steady and devoid of the malice she expected. The question seemed to shatter something inside her. Her head bowed, and the sharp edge of her arrogance dissolved into a raw, hollow despair. Then what would I have left? She whispered to the grass. If you take away this great bloodline from me, what do I have left? The desperate, rhythmic chanting of magic, 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 that always ended in silence. She looked up at him again, tears finally brimming as her voice cracked with years of suppressed frustration. Do you think I never tried? She collapsed further, her hands clawing at the earth as she poured out her confession. No matter how hard she exerted herself, the magic never came. Whether it was the arcane arts or the stroke of a paintbrush, she had been washed out of everything, falling behind in every pursuit that defined her peers. Then what do I have left besides bloodline? She wept, her face pressed near the dirt as the full weight of her perceived worthlessness took hold. If even that's gone, then. She wept, her face pressed near the dirt. If even that's gone, then, what am I? The boy remained silent for a moment before his sword began to glow with a faint, blue light. I've heard enough, he declared, raising the blade high. Goodbye. The girl closed her eyes, bracing for the end, but the strike never came. Instead, shards of ice erupted from the ground around her, encasing her in a shimmering, frozen bloom. She gasped, looking down at her hands to see them glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Magic, she stammered. The boy sheathed his sword with a sharp click. He offered a formal bow, his voice shifting to one of respectful acknowledgement. Good work, Lady Yahello, he said. Please pardon my rudeness. As the girl stared at him in stunned silence, a faint smile played on his lips. It may not be something you could truly call magic, as it's just a manifestation of mana, he explained, his red eyes softening. But you still did it. Yahello could only let out broken, sobbing breaths. Ugh. Guh, as the overwhelming weight of the moment forced a raw, wailing cry from her throat. She sat amidst the ice, weeping openly as the moon hung full and bright above them. That means you're from the School of the Wild, the boy said, standing before her as she began to settle. School of the Wild, she repeated, confused. That's right, he continued, his red eyes calm. I've hardly ever worked with the School of Regulations. He explained that while every school of magic is essentially the same, they differ significantly in the process of manifesting and harnessing it. You're from the School of the Wild. So trying to learn magic through the theory of the School of Regulations was bound to cause problems. He looked at her gently as the realization began to sink in for her. You weren't just trying to learn things that didn't fit you, he noted. It's like you were forcing yourself into clothes that didn't even fit your body. How did you know that? She asked, her voice small. That I'm from the School of the Wild, he finished for her. A small, knowing smile played on his lips. I saw the drawings you made. You could feel mana drifting through nature and you put it onto the canvas. Mages born with the temperament of the School of the Wild usually sense the mana in nature when they're young. You could feel mana drifting through nature and you put it onto the canvas. He reached out a hand, signaling that it was time to move on. Alright, that's enough. You should be able to walk now. Yahello stood, her legs still a bit shaky but her spirit renewed. This is not bad. With this much, she mused. You succeeded in manifesting mana, but you still have a long way to go. Starting tomorrow, I'll teach you how to manifest mana naturally, he said. Derek. She whispered, looking at him with newfound respect. Thanks. Derek simply turned toward the path. Let's go. Wait, I'm going with you, she called out, following him into the moonlit woods. As they walked, she couldn't help but ask, by the way, about that sunset painting. Was that your work? Derek paused slightly. What? I don't know. It's been a long time since I've picked up a brush. It was beautifully done, she insisted softly. It was a masterpiece. And you're the first person who realized my talent. The morning light filtered through the ornate windows of the manor, casting a soft glow over Lady Videla's bedchamber. Sitting upright, the young noblewoman stared intensely at her outstretched hand. Ethereal blue light danced around her fingertips, flickering with a cold, magical energy that seemed difficult to control. This is hard, she murmured to herself, her brow furrowed in deep concentration as the wisps of mana slowly dissipated into the air. The quiet of the morning was shattered when the heavy doors of her room swung open. A young maid, carrying a wooden bucket filled with water, hurried inside with her head bowed. In her haste, she failed to notice Vidila standing right in the path of the door. The bucket tipped, sending a cold wave of water soaking into the hem of Vidila's nightgown and onto the carpet. The maid gasped, her face draining of color as she realized what she had done. Lady Vidila, I am sorry, she stammered, dropping to her knees in a panicked bow. I apologize. The floor was. I lost my grip. The maid braced herself, trembling as she waited for the inevitable blow or the stinging lash of a noble's tongue. Vidila stood over her, her gaze cold and shadowed, making her appear far more intimidating than her small stature suggested. Watch where you're going, Vidila said simply. Without another word or a single gesture of violence, she turned and walked past the servant, leaving the room with a calm, steady stride. The maid remained on the floor, blinking in utter disbelief. What's happening? Why isn't she hitting me? She wondered, her heart still racing. She's just leaving, without doing anything else. In the hallway, other servants gathered around the shaken girl. Are you okay? You didn't get hit? One asked, leaning in with concern. Yes, the maid whispered, looking toward the corner where Vidila had disappeared. She only told me to be careful. The servants exchanged bewildered looks. What on earth happened after she went out last night? In the quiet, dim light of a private bedroom, Derek was deep in sleep until the silence was shattered by a sharp, persistent yelling. Derek, Derek! The white-haired boy groaned, clutching his head as the intrusive noise pulled him back to consciousness. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and squinting at the door. Ugh, what is it? He muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. Outside in the hallway, an elderly butler looked down at Lady Vidila with a mix of sternness and fatigue. Lady Della, you need to mind your manners, he chided, his hand resting near his monocle. This is inappropriate. Vidila, standing with her hands on her hips and an unwavering expression, ignored the lecture. Teach me how to handle the mana I manifested, she demanded. I tried on my own, but it's not working. The butler froze, his eyes widening behind his lens. She manifested mana. The news hit him with the force of a physical blow, yet Vidila gave him no time to process it. You said you'd teach me today, she continued, her blue eyes narrowing with impatience. So hurry up and teach me. Come back in the afternoon, he stated firmly, pride washed over him, causing him to dab at his eyes with a handkerchief. Lady Della finally. Behind them, the door remained firmly shut, but Vidila wasn't finished. She clicked her tongue in annoyance. TSK. Who do you think you are, telling me to come back later? Open the door right now, she shouted, her voice echoing through the wood. Teach me now. Hey, open the door. Inside the room, Derek simply pulled the covers back over his head,